Started. I'll give you a brief introduction first, Barry, before we get you up here.
Introduction.
Is that microphone?
Is the mic on?
Oh, there you go. You just had to get closer.
Okay. I could probably talk loudly enough without it, but I'll use it because I know we have folks, maybe at UNH, coming in on the teleconference. I'm Laura Linenfeld. I'm part of Maine's Sustainability Solutions Initiative, and it is my great pleasure today to bring to you Barry Costa-Pierce. I'll just do a brief introduction because I know Barry has his own chaos theory about his experience that he'll share with you. It's not chaotic at all. It's very focused. Barry is the Henry L. and Grace Dougherty Chair of Marine Sciences and Director of the Marine Science Program at the University of New England. I invited Barry to come and talk as part of the Sustainability Solutions Initiative speaker series because his work is really rooted in sustainability science. He focuses in particular on aquatic resource use, detrital food webs, which I learned a lot about working with you over the past year, Barry, in marine and aquaculture ecosystems, ecological and social carrying capacity of aquaculture systems, and the social ecology of seafoods and seafood value chains. Before he went to the University of New England, Barry served as director of Rhode Island Sea Grant and professor of fisheries and aquaculture at the University of Rhode Island. I think we were very lucky to get you here in Maine. Barry earned his PhD in oceanography at the University of Hawaii. That must have been a horrible experience, right? I know he still has research partnerships there. Maybe you need a good communication researcher to come along someday. I'll volunteer. And his master's in zoology from the University of Vermont. Barry was elected as a AAAS fellow based on his, quote, distinguished contributions to global aquaculture and its sustainability, and for leadership in marine research, education, and outreach, as director of 2 NOAA Sea Grant college programs, end quote. He's also the chair-elect of the board of directors for the international charity organization Aquaculture Without Frontiers. In the true spirit of sustainability science, Barry is deeply concerned with how science can help people and the planet. I had the pleasure of working with Barry on the development of a National Science Foundation proposal this past year, and it has been a wonderful experience, and I'm very, very glad that you're here to talk with this group today. So please welcome Barry Costa-Pierce. So Barry will talk, and then we'll hold some time for Q&A afterwards.
Thanks, Laura. So I was walking the dog this morning, and I was thinking about what to say in the next iteration of what the evolution of the Blue Revolution would be. And the dog was chasing a frog as I was walking down my dirt road. And so as I got closer to the frog said to me, "Pick me up, I'll give you a big kiss, give me a big kiss, and I'll turn into a princess." Well, you know, at my age, that's a really nice opportunity. So I thought about it, but I put the frog back in my pocket, and I walked along a little bit more, and the frog started going back and forth in my pocket, saying, hey, did you forget about me?" And I picked out the frog, and I said, "Well, you know, I've been thinking about it, but at my age, I need another talking frog." So today, I'm going to talk as a bit of a frog about what this career of 40 years of being amidst in the Blue Revolution, and I call it the evolution of the Blue Revolution because I've spent most of my career cross-dressing between capture fisheries and aquaculture, and I find myself again in the last 6 months now back in the midst of some phenomenal capture fisheries issues which are affecting planning for aquaculture both globally and locally. And I wanted to cover some of the dynamism today because it's always interesting. So as Laura mentioned, I have the second law of thermodynamics. This is my resume, which is, you know, everything tends towards chaos. I've lived in 5 countries and consulted in 21 as I was thinking about the number, you know, coming up here. And in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be 1,000 of us gathered in the Canary Islands of Spain talking about what we've done in the last 40 years as a global community in aquaculture and what's the next 40 years looking at. So this is a a good moment to sort of update you on, how this old man feels about what the next generation is for coastal leaders throughout the planet. And that's pretty bold. Okay, so this is where I'm at these days, is aquatic foods, ocean foods. But I always remember my days being in the Great Lakes of Africa, where it was capture fisheries of large lake ecosystems. So aquaculture and fisheries are connected intimately in the marketplace, of course. And any of you who produce whitefish know that tilapia impacted dramatically the cod and haddock market worldwide. So when you get down to the Boston Seafood Show, you'll see these products interacting intensely in the marketplace. Unfortunately, as you track back into our academies, these are still stovepiped. So the capture fisheries, people go to the capture fisheries conferences and they hardly talk about aquaculture. If they do, they talk about it in terms of fisheries enhancement. And the aquaculture people, they think that they're producing 50% of the world's seafood these days. Not true. And that whole evolutionary part of will aquaculture overtake capture fisheries in the next 20 years is very much of a debate in both of those communities. I'm one of the people that encourages all of our students in the next generation to go to capture fisheries conferences if you're an aquaculture person, and vice versa. And those of you who really want to take a risk, go to some seafood processing conferences in marketing. Okay, so this is what I've been promoting for at least since we wrote the paper in 2010, is that in order for the world's seafood needs, mainly driven by Asia, but now Asia is producing a tidal wave of fish, farm fish, coming to the rest of the world, then you need to think more comprehensively about the field of fisheries. So I would consider myself a fisheries scientist. And there's three parts of fisheries. True aquaculture, which some people over in our fisheries world still call culture fisheries. And then capture fisheries, that's the last great hunting left on the planet, except for moose in Maine, right? And then over here, enhanced fisheries. And that's often used, they use other words. I'm a stock enhancement scientist. And if you look at some of the interactions, and I'll just mention a couple here, this is true aquaculture, or what many of us call a closed aquaculture production network. We're actually doing selection and genetic improvement in this box. Hatcheries produce fry. I'm using fish right now. I could be using shellfish. Fry go into nurseries, fingerlings into grow out. You get adults. You select out of the adults the best, brood stock, and you do genetic improvements, species selection, etc. And you put it back in a hatchery. Okay, so that's really true aquaculture. Over here is an open aquaculture production network. A lot of people feel that there's very little true aquaculture in the world today, that if it wasn't for a wild that had integrity, intact wild marine and freshwater ecosystems that have genetically vibrant species, that you wouldn't be able to constantly improve this over here. So you have to go back to the wild a lot. But there are just some phenomenal-ish changes when you wake up a little bit. I'll never forget being in China, and this was about 10 years ago, in the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, when you saw all these people out there fishing in the spring. And you said, well, what are they doing? They must be capturing food fish. Not. They're capturing juveniles by the billions. Carp juveniles to feed the largest supposed aquaculture in the world. Carp fisheries, carp aquaculture is still the largest aquaculture in the world, by far. But it wasn't a true aquaculture until very, very recently. Now the World Bank put a ton of money in here, and you see hatcheries everywhere in China, and you see feeds. China is the largest now consumer of aquatic feeds in the world. Didn't used to be. It used to be all integrated systems with agriculture. And then here's our big, big controversy over here. What is the aquaculture contribution to the restoration of capture fisheries? This is a raging issue in salmon. We'll be there for the far into the future. Escapees are coming out of aquaculture and coming in here, and there's a big debate about what escapees are doing. That's just finfish. Just think about it for crustaceans, sea urchins, seaweeds even. put a seaweed lens on this. And in Maine, you have this, and you have some of this, probably not much of this. But when you start looking at aquatic foods more generally, you start seeing some interesting issues when you're at the interfaces. When you're just aquaculture and just fisheries, well, that's your comfort zone. When you start going to the interfaces, that's the disruptive innovations that are occurring. Okay, let's just look a little bit really into the FAO 2012 statistics, because you start hearing all over the place that the world's getting 50% of its seafood from aquaculture. Not. This is global fisheries production, 154. 50%, this is capture fisheries. This is 90, and that's aquaculture. And you say, well, it's about 50% BCP. Okay, let's look at it more closely. You look at it more closely, you'll see tremendous things going on in capture fisheries, tremendous innovations. In other words, new designs of bycatch gear out there for whitefish. Up until very recently, you could not harvest cod in the North Atlantic because there were gadoids that ran together with haddock. Those species were very, very difficult to sort. Cod was nearly an endangered fishery, or some people say a commercially extinct fishery, certainly here in the Gulf of Maine. But haddock had been completely recovered. It was hard to separate them. Well, fish behavioral scientists then started working on gear, and they found that when they towed a squid net that they sewed onto the front of a regular old cod net, that the fish separated themselves. The bow wave created such that the cod dove down through the meshes and the haddock just went right back to the cod end. One innovation immediately put on the market over 100,000 metric tons of new haddock into the North Atlantic. So let's sort through this. How does this affect aquaculture? So if you are, in my world, you are looking, again, sustainable supplies or increasing seafood supplies for humanity, you just can't look here, because I would say that with my pluses and minuses, I think there's as much potential here for global seafoods as there are here. Now, this is not what you hear in the press. The press tells you that all fisheries, Gulf of Maine cod, or all aquaculture, oh my goodness, what is going to happen with net pen salmon? So one of the things that we need to do, I think, is to be a more responsible set of professionals, is look very closely at some of these perceptions and tease out, maybe with the data, and see how far we can go with some of these. Challenge our friends to see how far can we actually imagine, but if we start putting into place, these are just as a small bit of the areas that we're working on in the fisheries world. We could be talking about closed areas, closed seasons, and how much new fish can we get out of this versus what is the real potential for increasing aquaculture. Okay, so let's talk about the future, the Anthropocene. So here in Maine, we've had a tremendous new development. We've signed an agreement with the country of Iceland, which will bring a tidal wave of salmon and whitefish to our shores through the city of Portland. Okay, so let's look at why that's occurring. So this is the ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, 2013 stock assessment. Not all cod are dead and dying. They just moved, a lot of them. So their new allocation is 1 million metric tons. It used to be upwards of 50,000, 80,000 metric tons. 1 million metric tons. And haddock is 200,000 metric tons. All of farm cod production in worldwide is only 20,000 metric tons, and I doubt it because the U.S. probably doesn't produce 1,000 metric tons. And even Norway and Iceland, probably 20,000 metric tons. So no matter how much potential farming of cod has, this is the fisheries reality that we're dealing with. Okay, now, how about that amazing amount of protein is coming up from the opening of the Arctic in the Barents Sea. So Maine is now this incredible opportunity for us being a near Arctic state. Most of the aquaculture leases, now notice that IMSCIP, this new container ship vessel, 40-foot roll-on, roll-off containers, highly efficient sea transport coming from, based in Reykjavik, going to be, notice they didn't go to New York, New Jersey, they signed an agreement with Portland. They're bringing this tidal wave of fish to our shores. Now what's going on? First of all, notice they didn't go to Oslo, the capital, because this is ice-free and becoming even more ice-free up in here. All of the new aquaculture farms in Norway are up in this region. The largest number of new salmon permits in the world is not Chile. It's right here in Murmansk, right on the other side of the border in Russia. So Murmansk, Tromsø, Reykjavik, and Portland. How about Nuuk over in here? Some scientists have just reported by U.S. salmon scientists, we're working with their Danish colleagues, that there's a lot of areas up here are ice-free now, and new salmon runs, large new salmon runs, occurring in the midst of the opening up of the glaciers here. And now the Canadians are talking about a salmon fishery in this particular area. In the midst of this is this big beast over here, China, the world's largest consumer of seafood by far. The largest amount of protein, per capita protein consumption, is not meat in China. By far, it's seafood. So there's a tidal wave of investment, I should say, in money in Iceland by China right now. There is many, many plans to move some of this protein over to China by air. So in the midst of this, a tidal wave of fish is coming in our direction. Salmon and whitefish offers huge opportunities and offer many constraints to the development of aquaculture. Okay, so let's look at aquaculture. And my contention is that we are not eating 50% of our seafood from aquaculture. China is eating more than 50% of seafood from aquaculture. So aquaculture, if you look at these statistics, is still for us and many professionals who spent 40 years in the field, is still pretty much at the pre-ancestor stage of development, like agriculture, if you compare it to agriculture. These are the top 10 species in the world farmed. And look at these: China, carp, common carp, Indonesia. I spent many years working in common carp aquaculture in Indonesia. Carp. Now, some of these are recognizable to us, but look at versus, of course, an oyster. So most of the world's protein, okay, the FAO statistics of that, 80-some million metric tons. So at the caveman stage, carps in China are 38% of all global aquaculture development. Now, China's part of the world. Yes, the world is eating 50% of its seafood from aquaculture. That doesn't mean that Americans are eating 50% of their seafood from aquaculture. It doesn't mean that Brazilians are eating 50% of their seafood from aquaculture. Indeed, America, it only gets like 1 to 2 to 3% of all of its total animal protein from aquaculture, or less. So that's the bone I have to pick with the FAO statistics and with the press saying that 50% of global seafood is coming from aquaculture. The other thing is that Chinese aquaculture does not feed the world. It feeds China. So these carps are not coming to the global shores of seafood eaters. Only 3.8 million metric tons of China's large production is exported. Most of it is kept at home, not rightly so. And here's our big challenge. Actually, aquaculture has declined in the United States and in Europe. Catfish farming is the largest percentage of aquaculture in the United States. Not salmon. Catfish. Catfish farming is in deep trouble. Deep trouble. It may disappear in the next 10 years for many reasons, because of global competition, primarily from Asia. The other big part is European aquaculture production has declined dramatically in the last few years. Now, that does not include Norway. If you look at the continent, you'll see that aquaculture is in great threat there. Where is aquaculture growing? It's growing tremendously in very, very few countries. Brazil, India, on the top of the list. Okay, so now a little bit of backtrack here on why I decided to put, with my friends, the ecological in front of aquaculture. I chose, at that time, not the sustainable rubric. That really hadn't caught, people's attention, that, what is the sustainability science part of aquaculture. That kind of came later. What really came first was this stuff, is that we were in the midst of a global blue revolution, and this is what it was going to look like. It was going to salmon stacked up like corn across fields all over the world. It was going to be finfish everywhere, all over the coasts of the world, all of the inland areas. And that was the idea. And so many of us who got into aquaculture really didn't think that we were going to get to the industrial food production side, that we were always going to be somewhere between the community-based and the small scale. And so then there was a large discussion at that time, almost like a schism with the white hat and the black hat people. Are you industrial food production system, or are you community-based, local, and all this other stuff? And then everybody realized we had to be both. We had to, the industrial food production has to become more sustainable, and what's the route there? And we still needed a whole bunch of community-based aquaculture, low energy, small scale. So the discussion, however, at that time was driven by scenes like this. And these scenes were not coming from North America. They were not coming from Brazil. They were coming from China. They were coming from Asia, where seafood demands and food needs far outweighed environmental concerns. Okay, so there were many people looking at this and saying, okay, is the Asian model of large-scale aquaculture production, is that the route for the rest of the world? And so people began to search for other routes if they said no. So some countries have said yes. The Asian aquaculture model is the way we're going to go. And if you look at that, there are some trajectories in that model coming from Asia that do have greater amounts of stewardship and sustainability. So we'd never want to kind of close that off, because Asia really is the center of production. And now, being the editor of the Aquaculture Journal coming out of Elsevier for the last 15 years, over 80% of our papers from science comes from China. So Asia is the center of global aquaculture science. It's the center of global aquaculture production. So we would always want to look at innovations coming from there and never denigrate this, because there is societal decisions that are being made to allow this to happen in those countries. However, it was clear from many of our colleagues globally that they were searching for an alternative path to the development of aquaculture. So a bunch of us got together and talked about not the Blue Revolution, but the evolution of the Blue Revolution. So why did we do that? And so now I'm going to go back to a little bit of storytelling, and a little bit of the history of myself and a few other of my friends who tried to find out, once the white hat, black hat people started, people started sort of go to taxi cab driver, getting out of a meeting in Vancouver, going to the airport, and the taxi cab driver said to me, well, what have you been doing here, sir? I said, I've been to an aquaculture meeting. And he says, are you for it? Are you against it? And I started realizing that there was a large cadre of people who were really against aquaculture. And it blew my mind, because I knew aquatic food production was much more advanced in terms of all of its ecological and potential energy efficiencies and food efficiencies than terrestrial animal agriculture. We were all trained that way. But people were opposing us. So I started asking these questions in global travels. What is this? How did I get involved with it? Did it evolve from capture fisheries? Where was it from? Okay, so this was a little ditty we put together because this was adequate in order in the 70s when we were working on aquaculture. If you were able to reproduce animals in captivity, you were able to feed them, you had a market, you'd make money. And that's what we taught. The feed, the seed, and the need. Really that simple. Then life got really complex because fisheries and aquaculture and communities started butting heads, and we realized that it was more of a sustainability science model. That we had people are not plankton, so we couldn't only study plankton, we had to study people, and we had to study, all of these interactions. Any of you who followed the development of aquaculture know that this has been a huge issue right here. The Peruvian ecosystem producing fish meal and fish oil to feed carnivores put there out there in the global market. Okay, it's getting better. Okay, well, it's getting better as now people are using soybeans. So what does that mean? So does that mean that we're going to destroy all the pampas of Argentina and plant out soybeans to feed carnivores to produce fish? So everywhere you turn, you can't escape the larger nexus of issues that involved what you're doing, the feed, seed, and the need in the markets. Down here is what I was talking about. You go to the Boston Seafood Show, you see aquaculture products, unless they are distinct, particularly whitefish, they're bumping right up against fisheries whitefish products. Cod and haddock and tilapia are in the same whitefish market. Okay, so the first thing that our group started working on is that none of this was new. It was thousands of years old. We knew it. You get the old Chinese example of growing carps in the same pond. We knew that. But was that, how common was that? Why did the Chinese do that? And so this is what we found, and I'll cover a couple of examples, that there's nothing about aquaculture that's new or alien, that it's part of who we are as sophisticated people living on this planet. It's part of our planetary wisdom. And our working hypothesis was this. Whenever the seafood needs of seafood-eating people exceeded the ability of the wild capture fisheries or aquatic ecosystems to provide for them, they developed aquaculture. When you tease that out, it's a powerful hypothesis because you have to have seafood-eating peoples whenever the needs of seafood-eating peoples. Now that means you should go to cultures that actually have the largest percentage of their seafood is coming from aquatic sources, not from terrestrial. Fiji. People in Fiji eat over 40 kilograms, some villages, 40 kilograms a week of seafood. Nearly 100% of the seafood, of their protein needs is from seafood. Americans are among the lowest consumers of seafood in the world. We get 99%, 98% of our protein from terrestrial sources. So let's kind of look at the working hypothesis. I started here. This was the first part, as you heard. Those 40, you might have heard Laura say, Masters of Science from the University of Vermont. I was setting gill nets underneath the ice at 40 degrees below zero on Lake Champlain looking at whitefish. And then I went to my mailbox and I got accepted to the University of Hawaii for a PhD. So one of the things that we did, of course, was get to know the Hawaiians. I lived in Hawaiian communities, and most of what they ate was seafood. They had to have seafood. And so there was these places on the islands, these sort of blind river valleys, where farming systems went from the shore right up to the mountains. So when Captain Cook arrived, when he the first white guy to discover, quote unquote, Hawaii was already a place without discovering itself. But when he sailed in, there was 360 fish ponds, marine, integrated freshwater fish ponds going all the way up these valleys. Hawaii was one of the most densely populated places in the world, estimated by our friends, who demographers, in the 1700s when he sailed in. One of my Hawaiian friends said to me, "Hey, Haole," it's a name for a white guy, "what did you expect? If you looked at the city of Honolulu, looked at the same density it is today, and everybody was brown, That is the size of the population when Captain Cook arrived. And if you imagine, most of them ate seafood. They depleted their marine resources. And so they developed these incredible farming systems. They were supposedly one of the inventors of marine aquaculture. They built these massive seawater ponds throughout the islands, in every island. And you go into the archives, you found out they found out how to feed them, how to take the detritus away from them, and they had a whole class. This is on my book, Makoa, the mullet runner. There was a whole class of aquaculture scientists. There was a whole class of aquaculture marathon runners who used to run these tasty fish, the mullets and the milkfish from the ponds, to the ali'i up in the mountains here. This is Mauna Loa, where they lived for their tastiest meals. So there was a very sophisticated aquaculture culture in Hawaii when Captain Cook arrived. Are they alone? This is a couple of the pictures. This is, kind of a pictorial rendering, but it's got all the elements. There was integrated fish ponds, aquaculture ponds, there were freshwater lake ponds, there was integrated taro or carbohydrate plus fish farming, and there was conservation areas. It wasn't perfect. It was a certain social setting. The kings and the queens had kapus, restricted areas. Same with China. It's not an open society like a lot of places. There's lots of reasons, social cultural reasons, why aquaculture can proceed as we've seen in Asia. Same here in Hawaii as in ancient times. Then we started looking, okay, so that was their hemisphere, that way out in the Pacific, either Asia or the Pacific. But how about what was the basis of the food needs of a densely populated Central American Aztec Inca cultures? And it was this system, the Chinampa system, which was spread all over Central America down through South America. And it was an integrated aquaculture, agriculture farming system. So they ate large amounts of aquatic protein. They learned how to farm in very, very tropical, highly drained soils. And now today, you go to some places, these are in Mexico and Peru, and this is some of they're trying to recover these systems as the good way of doing farming. It happened back then, it was a good idea then, it's a good idea now. And then probably the most dramatic of them all, which people are starting to find out that, is the Amazon a artificially created human environment? Was the Amazon actually most of it deforested at one time? Because they're finding in the middle of the Amazon, you probably heard of them, the mound people and these big temples, and they're out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the jungle. Well, was it always jungle? Well, now with ground penetrating radar in this particular area of the Beni, they're finding this. Now this tree's here. This is ground penetrating radar, which shows these big giant canals, chinampas, as far as the eye can see. Densely populated areas of integrated agriculture, aquaculture farming systems that allowed their culture to develop very high population densities. We're only finding out about some of these. Now, how about in the marine environment? A lot of the Pacific Coast cultures, the Canada's West Coast, the First Nations going all the way down to the American Indian nations in Washington and Oregon, very, very highly densely populated when the European settlers arrived. And our friend Judith has written this book just recently on Aboriginal mariculture. It's her contention that not only is it aquaculture as culture, this is the way they imagine themselves coming on the planet as societies, but they also feel that the reason why they were able to reach these very high population densities was because of the level of shellfish aquaculture development. Okay, so let's come a little bit closer to home. In 1972, now this is salmon. Salmon is 70 million in mostly net pens in Cobscook Bay and in our state. Right across the border in Passamaquoddy Bay, it's one of Canada's largest aquaculture productions, same in BC. And we all think that, there's a lot of salmon out there, and, we must know everything about salmon. Well, right here in 1972, okay, it goes up, you see it goes up very high. In 1972, that's the book I studied, Aquaculture, in 1972. It was everything you could have read about aquaculture was encompassed in one book. And that was when I graduated in 1972. Okay, so notice something down here. There's no farm salmon in 1972. And then I got my PhD in 84, and there was the first farm salmon. Yes, there was some experiments over here. But the first farm salmon started hitting the market right here, and of course it's grown tremendously. But just, again, aquaculture is at the pre-ancestor stage of development in comparison to agriculture. Yes, it's got a long 1,000 years of history, but this kind of aquaculture is developed in the time of the life of the man speaking to you today. And that is rare to say, that one type of a whole new field, quote unquote, industrial salmon farming, has grown up in my lifetime. And it's not alone. We had friends at the University of Hawaii who were doing not science of shrimp aquaculture, they were doing art. Someday they could reproduce them, next day they'd all die, 1 month they'd have them, next month they wouldn't have them. So when we put all of this together, we said there's been many blue revolutions throughout human history. We're only in one of the more challenging one with anywhere between 8 to 10 billion people projected on this planet. So we have to find some of these sustainable trajectories for all kinds of aquaculture. Intensive land-based, intensive, sustainably intensive, if that's what you want to use, near shore. And so we have to have aquatic food production models that exhibit huge amounts of stewardship, huge amounts of community connection, where industries of the future are paying attention to all kinds of stakeholders. So what's the pathway some of the pathways that are going on right now? This is one that I've invested in, a lot of people, hundreds of people now have invested in, is coming up with new guidelines. Global guidelines for an ecosystems approach to aquaculture. You see FAO published these guidelines after putting together all of these reviews on kind of where we were at. So what we have now is guidelines from many countries of the world, like, for example, Mozambique. Mozambique has enormous potential for aquaculture. Mozambique has been approached by the global investor community, Mozambique, to develop nearly all of their shorelines for aquaculture. And Mozambique up to this point didn't have any guidelines. It would say, yes, jobs, economic development, please come, we need that, we're starving. But then what was occurring in too many places is there was promises being made by aquaculture investors for jobs and economic development that were not aligned to greater levels of community and ecosystem stewardship. So now we have these guidelines. We have some global guide. You don't need to go to a seafood card, or you don't need to go develop your own guidelines. You can go to a globally recognized organization and say, you as a decision maker in Mozambique can say, do you, Mr. and Mrs. Investor, do you follow the FAO guidelines for an ecosystem approach to aquaculture? And if you do, then tell us how you're going to develop our industry and our knowledge community over time. Okay, so we've put together this as sort of a quote-unquote a new field of sustainability science, because it doesn't separate ourselves from fisheries. It puts ecology in front of everything. And there are some of these fields now have taken off, have their own journals, their own communities, like this one. Ecological engineering. If you go to the Journal of Ecological Engineering, you'll find people publishing aquaculture papers there. You'll find people ecosystem-based management. You'll find ecosystem-based management journals and societies with aquaculture people in there. And you'll talk about people who do ecological design. That's what they do. Ecological design of aquatic food production systems. So, but the goal here is the triple bottom line, right? It's innovation, it's economically and social, but profitable too. And you think I'm not walking on air or in the clouds right now. This is happening because consumers are buying into this, not only from labeling, but from also these new approaches where businesses have incredible marketing plans. They have CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers within their business, in aquaculture businesses, who are concerned about the next step. Okay, very quickly, this is what the ecosystem approach is, adopted by FAO. And this is very important, part of what was featured in our EPSCoR proposal. So, again, stakeholders. So it's not an end result, it's a process. So, the process sometimes will never end, or maybe shouldn't ever end, because these are evolutionary systems, they involve stakeholders, and then they change as circumstances allow. So this is where I'm going to go into a little bit about the social contract for aquaculture development. And of course, my model, a lot of this has to do with shellfish. Shellfish is not the finfish people, but the shellfish people, to me, have done a tremendous job in convincing a large group of stakeholders, a large group of scientists worldwide, that they are one of the areas that the globe needs to pay attention to increase aquaculture production immediately. So they've been able to garner a social contract. And we put together this paper at the World Seafood Congress, which tried to summarize this. It's really important that a lot of these fields in aquaculture now, with that one book in 1972, now you can go to whole libraries about aquaculture. You'll have like half the library on aquaculture nutrition, half of the library on aquaculture hatcheries. So it's exploded, the amount of information that we have available. So now it's important that some of us, the older folks, work together with the younger folks to say, okay, where are we at? Where are we at after 40 years of investing in this? So our couple of summaries were in a National Research Council, National Academy study. Myself and a few of our colleagues put together this study on ecosystem concepts for sustainable biomariculture. And this was just a highlight of of some of the things that we said, okay, in the 21st century, now, 2012, 2013, where are we at? Well, we've got a whole new engineering that's developed with submerged and offshore technologies. Back in the old days, you used to have these rafts everywhere, and there was visual pollution and people complaining about it. Now, you don't really need rafts. Yeah, rafts are maybe some good ideas in some places. But if you're in a crowded riparian coastal area of the world, maybe you could submerge technologies. How about marinas? People are doing all kinds of hatchery systems underneath the docks of marinas because they found out marinas are not polluted. Au contraire, it's that top little area up there which can sometimes have some oil and gas pollution and hydrocarbons. If you get underneath that, the water quality is fine year-round in many of these marinas. So what people have done is develop hatcheries underneath marinas. They've looked at what kind of ecosystem goods and services. There was a study that was done that compared rack and bag shellfish gear to eelgrass habitat as essential fish habitat, and the rack and bag shellfish gear had a higher essential fish habitat index for recruitment of juveniles than the eelgrass did. What does that mean for the regulators? Because if you mess with eelgrass in any way, shape, or form, the regulators immediately will cut you off at the knees about your shellfish aquaculture permit. But that's back in the old days. Now, what about the new science? Down here, all scales of production, publication of showing that comparisons with fed aquaculture, a strong movement towards ecological approaches to aquaculture at all scales of production. Many of these have best or better management practices, the industry. There is a lot going on here. Breaking down the barriers between fisheries and aquaculture using communities, particularly in shellfish. What this means is that if you look at fishing livelihoods, what you find is that there's a lot of fishing people, fishers, both men and women, fishing families, who don't fish full time. They fish part time. And so what do they do the rest of their life? They do construction, so they find another way to survive. And so you ask these communities, you ask them, would you still want to be out on the water if we could develop some sort of way of getting a more comprehensive livelihood? The answer has been a resounding yes. And so what you're finding is huge numbers of fishing families moving into part-time shellfish farming. And last of all is that we think that all of these carrying capacity works that have been done in this field have sophisticated collaborative working group processes which have created these new social contracts with agencies and the public. Okay, so we think that it's ready for prime time. There's not only a science consensus, but there's an NGO consensus. All of the environmental, non-governmental organizations, many of them fighting intensely about net pen salmon, for example. They love shellfish aquaculture. And it's because of all of this hard work to fit in, and it fits in areas that are already crowded with existing users, and even in the offshore. So up until this time, we all in the aquaculture community have been bellyaching that we can't develop aquaculture where summer residents or rich people are taking up all of that land along the coast. Not true. There's many, many examples of shellfish aquaculture developing in crowded areas with the existing riparian landowners. Okay, the other really interesting thing that's evolved here is the social perception, the social ecology of shellfish aquaculture. This is eventide in Portland. And those of you who belly up to the bar, like I usually do, and get some of these amazing, they're like terroir. They've been branded as watershed-based, like fine wine. And they have a different sort of feel, a different story behind each of these, a farming community that has supported that farmer as well as the neighbors. It's a social ecological system. And in our mind, so you've heard, salmon, I would never, you see the bumper stickers. Friends don't let friends eat farm salmon. Tilapia is not a fish. And so you hear people saying this, I would never eat wild farm salmon. I only eat wild. It's completely different. Over in this set, so you have people say, I will not touch a wild mussel. I got to have my rope-grown mussels. You see, we're marketing these as rope-grown mussels. Oh, and in oysters, of course. People don't eat wild oysters anymore. They eat these amazing products that have lots of knowledge. Okay, so this is another, so again, welcome to the Anthropocene. If we are going to start really looking at developing aquaculture, then we have to use some baby steps. We can't just immediately go into hundreds of millions of dollars of new investment. We've got to see what might fit. So we've talked about on the U.S. East Coast and here in Maine, we've got a Saudi Arabia of energy off of our coast. So I was involved in a project for about 10 years in southern New England that looked at what we were going to do with offshore wind. And we were talking about not floating windmills, but pounding them into the ground as single pole machines, anywhere between 3 to 8 megawatt machines. So then people started saying, well, you're going to put all that new structure out there. What's that going to do for aquaculture and fisheries? So we got into the offshore aquaculture development side of it. And so this is, we started this in 2003 with a meeting in New Brunswick of the global community. And then we just came up with this pretty interesting declaration in Germany on an offshore declaration on how we were going to go forward as a global community. And this is one of the things that we adopted right away. We're over here in this space, which is using these words. This is what the words that we've all agreed that if we're going to go forward in this type of aquaculture, it would all be in this type of a participatory approach. So we had a meeting in Bremerhaven, and as you probably all know, Europe is going absolutely berserk about offshore wind, particularly UK. And why in the UK? Well, the Queen owns all the land. The Crown owns all of the underwater land, okay? So, when the Queen says that you're going to develop offshore aquaculture, offshore wind, that's what's happened. Well, so that special jurisdictional type of arrangement doesn't occur in many countries. So countries like Denmark, this is the Horms Rev type of development, they've decided as a society to move forward. But I wanted to give you that high-level political part of the offshore wind, because you've experienced it here with Statoil and with the University of Maine, that it's a societal decision to move in this direction. It bumps right up against the fishing community, and it's our public trust. And the next part of it is, what are we going to do about all that new habitat out there? Is this present all kinds of opportunities, or is it a big loss? So if you look at it globally, and you put these together, here's the aquaculture, here's the amount of wind energy that's been put into place in the last few years. We are going to have a lot more habitat out in the ocean in many parts of the world. So thinking about how to start, we can envision over here, but you got to start somewhere. And one of the first things that we looked at was in a place like this, and this one is off of the UK. This is a jacket structure. There's an enormous amount of new surface area there. And what happens when you have an enormous amount of surface area? In the Santa Barbara Channel, which has all of these oil and gas structures in the Santa Barbara Channel, the legs of the platform are colonized by mytilus, by mussels. And in some cases, these mussels are upwards of 9 feet deep on the sides of the legs of the platform. And then what happens is that because there's so much energy, the mussels that are right up against so much ocean energy, the mussels that are right up against the legs of the platform still have enough oxygen and are still alive. But then it reaches a critical mass and it sloughs up and falls down and ends up right at the base of the legs, where it begins to degrade and produce acids, and oxygen goes to zero, and you start having problems with the legs of the platforms. And so a company, a very entrepreneurial company, asked the question, could we go out there with divers and venturi pumps and harvest these mussels and sell them on the open market? Well, it went crazy. Not only were they able to get FDA approval for harvesting the mussels because they were uncontaminated from hydrocarbons, they became the largest source of, what do you call these mussels? Aquaculture, fisheries mussels in the state of California. So that was the first place we've proposed, is to start a new, whatever it is, fishery aquaculture for mussels off the legs of these new wind power structures, and to get the next generation of pumps out there and the next generation of entrepreneurs to look at moving those into markets. So then you get to the dreamy stage. Okay, now this is actually going on off the coast of Germany. In the coast, the German government has actually given leases, and you notice it's almost all shellfish, for submerged leases to harvest off the towers and to actually put shellfish, submerged rack and bag, and other long-line shellfish culture in the midst of these wind power towers. And then really far is, here's our Steve Page Searsport, Maine aquapods. These rigid structures are being considered to be used for finfish aquaculture, because in the German Bight, these type of structures, not jackets, but called tripiles, they're enormous, and they're thinking of putting these in the midst of these tripiles for finfish aquaculture, but that's pretty far out into the future. Again, you got to walk before you run. Okay, so I'm going to sort of end here, and you could start now dreaming in your backyard or on your boat about this. If you were start to really think about, okay, what's the future of fishing and a merged future of fishing and aquaculture? What's one possibility? And I want you to think about many other possibilities, but this is one we've started to actively work on. And we see we've given ourselves 2025. And for ocean nations, for ocean nations who are really seriously are going to go into this space of sustainable, more sustainable fisheries and accelerated aquaculture development. Well, first thing we know, we got to fish better. Okay, that means fishing less in many cases. Why do fishermen, fishing families fish a lot? They fish harder because of the regulatory environment. They fish harder because we have stocks that are in deep, deep trouble, and they're right on the edge. So what you'll find is a boat coming into Gloucester, I'm saying 10,000 kilograms a day. In some cases, you'll see 50 to 80,000 kilograms a day. And a lot of that fish, I mean, this is all those of you economists, it's totally elastic. They bring in more, the price goes down. Then, other thing, if you've ever been to the fish exchange in Gloucester, okay, you will see, go to a restaurant right across the way, you'll see that fish still going on refrigerated 40-foot containers, going to be processed in Thailand and then be shipped back to a restaurant right across the street from the fish exchange in Gloucester. It's still happening, okay? And it's a certain level of insanity, like the Maine lobster industry, like 90% of the lobster coming back to Maine is from Canada, but we send it to Canada. Okay, so there's some insanity going on here, which we have to redesign this. In other words, they have to fish less. So if they fish less, maybe the price could be higher, but that means they're going to treat the product better. So why don't they treat the product better? Because they don't have the technology. They don't have the live hold, if that's what it's required. They don't have maybe an aquaculture engineering device. Fish less, live hold offshore, live hold in the near shore. Fishermen are going not fishing every day. Maybe they're taking it from their containment vessel offshore or their containment near shore. More capital, fishing less, better product quality, market enhancement. So here's where aquaculture, quote unquote aquaculture, this is an aquaculture engineering advancement, and not actually using it here in this particular case for grow out. We're using it for containment. And the engineering advances are the moorings and making it less visual pollution to the public. So a future fishing family would fish less, have live hold tanks here, be able to store offshore or in the near shore, work with the aquaculture engineers who know how to do all of this for market enhancement. And then the next part is that this is the nexus. We think that for fishing, shellfish fishing and farming is going to, with offshore fishing and containment, could be a possibility for a future vision for a lot of these fishing families. So, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Would your list of 10 have changed if you had included all aquaculture species from the sea?
Which list now?
The list of 10 you showed early in your seminar.
Would it have changed? No, it gets to be sort of minor species after that. So you can see even salmon, even though it's important here, it's still only number 10. So maybe not getting your question if I included all of the...
Sea vegetables.
Okay.
Because that industry,
Yes.
which was very ecological, started
Yes.
in both Japan and China in the 1950s and 1960s in a big way.
Yeah, I didn't include sea vegetables because... why didn't I include sea vegetables? I don't know why I didn't include sea vegetables. Yes, the list would have changed because global production of seaweeds is quite high. Yep. However, the idea that sort of almost all of the sea vegetables are eaten in Asia. Hardly any of it is eaten anywhere else. So Japan and China still take up most of seaweed aquaculture production. So the percentage of global aquaculture production, sort of the percentage of aquaculture feeding the globe, that whole idea wouldn't have changed. It would still be Asia feeding Asia. So aquaculture in Asia still doesn't feed the world.
But I guess the number of people in Asia is pretty high.
That's right. So, but you can't say, for example, that 50% of aquaculture, that finfish or seaweeds feeds all nations at 50% of their total seafood production. And that's the way the press, and that's the way the public has taken this on. You see it, it's got a life of its own. Yes, Mike.
You talked about that there were places where rich people live, who own valuable property where you could have aquaculture, where there is aquaculture production.
Yep.
What does that amount to right now? I mean, my impression is that places where you have retirement communities, valuable land, that their interest is in growing a few oysters for their cocktail parties. I think our experience in Maine has been that wherever you've tried to go to do aquaculture in those kind of areas, you either set the industry back years, sometimes decades,
Yep.
in terms of permitting and regulation, just by proposing it.
Yep.
Does it really amount to anything in terms of actual production in those areas?
I wouldn't have the exact statistics, Mike, in terms of like the amount of sort of rich people and putting those together, those two statistics. Those that doesn't exist. I can tell you that there are really good, promising examples of very densely populated coastal areas, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, where shellfish aquaculture is growing tremendously. So now in Maine, which is very interesting, and I'm not going to, let's just put Maine aside. There has been a lot of discussion about have we had sophisticated social ecological processes with the actual stakeholders who are there, or have we then decided to go into like a town meeting, and that's the first time they hear about the proposal. There's been a lot of people who feel that, for example, who owns the coast these days are people not only just in Maine, but in a lot of states in the United States. The people who own the coast are not from the place. And so there's been some discussion about, how much have we actually engaged those people in even beginning education processes. Forget about the sophisticated processes. And there really isn't a lot of really good information about that. Oftentimes, what we have found, and this is just, again, ad hoc information, is that the people who actually own the land, the riparian land, the only time they've ever heard about aquaculture is from the press, from their local newspaper that a hearing is going to be held. They have to vote on something, and then it's immediately into opposition because they haven't been included. Now, is the working hypothesis would be is if they were included, would it make a difference? Nobody kind of really knows, but this is a national, not only U.S. but Canadian, and a growing problem in the world is the lack of education about food production in general and what are the merits of different types of food production. So I think particularly for some of these low-hanging, well, I wouldn't call them fruit, low-hanging seafoods, like shellfish and seaweeds. I think we've got a tremendous opportunity, a new opportunity here. And then I have to think that in the future, that will lead towards another re-examination of finfish aquaculture in the coastal zone. Particularly as we have these new submerged technologies that are only just at the beginning stages of development that don't have a lot of engineers. I was in an ocean engineer, a school that had large ocean engineering program, 20 faculty members, and not a single one of them did any aquaculture engineering. And so we basically, I think that we're right at the beginning stages still of a lot of this discussion and development. Another one that was said, Mike, to me that really caught my attention is, how sophisticated has been our sighting process. That, maybe like if people always talked about the Blue Hill salmon thing until they're blue. And, they talked about, okay, so it was proposed here, but, over here there is, behind here there is a big cliff, and there's no houses like over here and over here. And so why was it said here, rather than here? And so I think as we get better with the spatial planning and some of the idea of engagement with riparian landowners, it might change. Yes, Chris.
I'd agree that we have to engage those people because not only are they not from the place, they have little connection to the water other than recreation. So I think we do need to engage these people. They are smart, so they are trainable. Your list of 10, I was surprised to see oysters at the top of that list.
Yep.
Is that because they're in the shell? And they're simply
Yeah.
that much more weight?
Yeah, that's not meat.
Right. So if it became a meat only, do you have any idea where it might fall there?
It would be much lower, Mike. It'd probably be, but I can imagine it'd be still in the top 10 because they're farmed everywhere. Gigas is just everywhere. But that's the FAO statistics. I mean, it's always stunning to me, to look at these, the carps, I always ask, how many people in the audience really like to eat carp? I mean, it's just so alien for, people in other places in the world to eat carp. But that's aquaculture. That's global aquaculture that FAO reports. Yes?
I'm sure you've heard the argument that the main lobster fishery is a quasi-aquaculture operation because of all the bait that we put into the water that subsidizes the population. So from that perspective, I'm wondering if you have any insights about how to make the main lobster fishery more environmentally sustainable. Obviously, the populations are sustainable of lobsters, but in terms of the environmental impact, do you have any insights about how to improve that?
There's some really interesting, about the lobsters themselves and that fishery, no, because I think there's people at this university, Bob Stenick and others, who are much further, they've spent their whole career thinking about this. Just one, listening to the Rargon people in Portsmouth a couple of weeks ago, the alarm is starting to be in general about the future and with climate change, et cetera, about where that's going. It might all go to Canada in our lifetime, in terms of the movement. But there's been some interesting stuff with our community of using the gear that they have available. The lobster gear, the types of boats that they have, the winches and the way they store them, and as people, there's been a lot of aquaculture people actually looking at that and sort of saying, okay, so if I put a different type of winch on, could they have a mussel farm? Could they do rack and bag or submerged shellfish gear? And so one could well imagine some sophisticated student projects, graduate students working on, in an ocean engineering sense, in a cooperative research sense, cooperative research with the lobster fishing community, to get more and more people involved. Now, that's already happening with Maine Sea Grant, with Dana Morse, working on some scallop, farming projects together with some fishing families, and that shows great promise. I think this whole area, when you look at the sort of size of the lobster industry, and the future of fishing communities mid-coast to down east, I think is way underinvested in terms of the potential future catastrophe that we could have with those communities. So it's something that we really, really need to think about, how to accelerate our interaction with the fishing communities. Yes?
You paint a very optimistic view of the aquaculture, where we could go with aquaculture, but you didn't really talk about things like some of the viral diseases that have gone through all these more densely grazed and the sort of cumulative effects that we could see from these things.
Yeah, so that's one area, like for example, diseases, pathogens, exotics, non-indigenous species that's one area where we absolutely need more expertise. This whole early mortality syndrome, EMS, that just roared through farm shrimp this last couple years. Everybody in the world of billions and billions of dollars that were poised were going to Don Leitner's lab at the University of Arizona, and that was one of the only places on the planet that they could have gone to. So that's really alarming, because no matter what level, looking at terrestrial farming, if we are going to have, and we are accelerating aquaculture throughout the world, we will have all of these issues. And so every single issue that has roared through wild stocks and the controversies does the wild infect aquaculture more than the aquaculture infects the wild? We need much more expertise in that area, and the globe is not recruiting enough people in that area. Yes, Ian.
Barry, I get a lot of inquiries about eel aquaculture at the moment because it's such a hot topic. How do you think ecological aquaculture will fit with the eel story? Because it's a classic. They're caught in Maine, raised in Asia, and then sold back to us.
Yeah, absolutely classic. With eel aquaculture, I think we've got to walk before we can run. So, yeah, we can bring over our Danish friends and the Germans and people from Asia, and we can sort of learn what they've done. And I think that would be a good idea. But I'm, looking at that, it's very highly energy intensive, extremely costly, and I would want to have a cadre of folks, who can start to get some elvers and start to do some extraordinarily simple first step. Can we take some of our elvers from the existing fyke nets? Can we contain them at low mortality? Can we begin to use some of our existing resources to feed them? Now, that may not be tanks, that may be some sort of other containment, ponds, raceway type environments, some other lower cost, lower capital costs, lower operating cost. That's the innovation portfolio in eel aquaculture is, I think, what we need to look at very, very carefully. We can bring our friends from Europe and Asia and to listen to them, but I think we need a new level of innovation. Now, some of this is already happening. When we were up with the Passamaquoddies, we had a Passamaquoddy fisherman who says that he takes some of the elvers and he puts them in containment and he starts to feed them, and they grow, and this is a really, really good place to start, is putting humane scientists together with a grad student with a fishing person like that who's got sort of innovation and trial and error ideas in spades, and then start innovating with that. And that's some blue sky, blue sea stuff that I've been experienced directly. I think glass elvers are very, very difficult. Even just those initial stages, there might be a master's degree just there. Fyke nets to containment and survival rates. Yes.
You referred once to intensive land-based aquaculture, and with increasing population, there's more and more limits on water and land. Would you care to expand on the opportunities there?
Tremendous opportunities. So in one of our recent meetings, FAO put together, it's every 10 years FAO puts together a meeting of the global aquaculture community, and we had a meeting in Phuket about 4 or 5 years ago. And I put together a group for them of 20 global experts on, our panel was called Resource Use in Aquaculture. And we looked at, energy and feed and water. And clearly, land-based wins out on almost all of the life cycle assessments, except for one, and that's energy. So the energy issues, I think the technology of land-based aquaculture, the feed issues, the hatchery issues, we're ready for prime time. I think the global community is ready. Where we found an enormous hole was on the energy side. And we called in our paper for a global priority to work together with to get the innovative energy systems people working with the land-based recirculating aquaculture food people in a combined energy food system sense. We found that, if you looked at, geothermal, solar, wind, high capacity efficiency systems, most of the aquaculture people were still mired in 1970s poorly thought through buildings from an energy perspective, hardly any thought about insulation and orientation, and here you had all these passive energy building people over here, massive amounts of expertise, and then you have all of the renewable energy people and the aquaculture people over here, completely alone, without thought, thinking that all the way through. So, recirculating, as you know, it's always going to be feed is the highest operating cost. Energy is going to be right behind it. A lot of people think we can get the feed to the point where it's economically viable. I think the energy and the building issues are still out there. Maybe someday somebody will actually pull that community together and have the next generation land-based food energy system that would bring together all of these renewable and efficiency people and building people.
Thank you.
Yes?
How about you just commented on energy intensity. How about using the offshore energy to feed some aquaculture on site? You just talked about the habitat, actually add some offshore structures. How about use the energy at the sea and for
Yeah, there was at the Bremerhaven meeting in Germany a couple of years ago, there was a scientist working on electric boats. And of course there was people dreaming about sort of an electric lobster boat and things like that. But basically where the platform would be a food holding platform, a food production platform, and there would be an energy platform as well as a safety platform, but there would be energy available on the platform to charge a series of coastal fishing vessels. So that is actually being thought through in Germany. There's another project in Norway on that right now.
Well, Barry, thank
you.
you so much. Thank you all for coming. Grab a cookie, some coffee.